Picture this. You're a 33-year-old man from Colorado on what should be a spiritual adventure through Australia. You decide to walk into the Great Sandy Desert, 140,000 square miles of pure hell on Earth. You have no GPS, no satellite phone, no emergency beacon. Just a small backpack, minimal water, and an unshakable faith that you'll find your way. But then, you get lost. Completely, hopelessly lost. The temperature soars to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Your water runs out on day 2. Your body begins to consume itself. Your mind starts to fracture under the relentless assault of heat, thirst, and isolation. How long can a human being survive without water? Medical experts say 3 to 4 days, maybe 5 if you're incredibly lucky. Robert Bogucki survived 12 days. 12 days of hell that should have killed him 10 times over. 12 days that saw him lose 44 pounds as his body literally ate itself alive. 12 days that transformed a Colorado tourist into a walking skeleton who somehow, impossibly, refused to die. This isn't just a survival story. This is a story about the moment when the human body reaches its absolute limit and the human spirit decides to keep going anyway. This is about what happens when medical impossibility meets unbreakable will. This is the story of a man who walked through the valley of death for 12 days and came out the other side. A man who proved that sometimes when everything logical says you should die, holding on for just one more step can lead to a miracle. Get ready for 12 days in hell. 12 days that rewrote the textbooks on human survival. 12 days that nobody should survive. But one man did. July 1999, Perth, Western Australia. Robert Bogucki, a 33-year-old fire protection engineer from Golden, Colorado, stood at the edge of the Great Sandy Desert with a sense of spiritual calling that would soon become a fight for his very life. Bogucki wasn't your typical tourist. A deeply religious man with an adventurous spirit, he had come to Australia not for the beaches or the cities, but for something deeper. He wanted to walk across the desert, a spiritual journey, a test of faith, a chance to experience the raw power of one of Earth's most hostile environments. The Great Sandy Desert sprawls across northwestern Australia like a vast furnace. 140,000 square miles of red sand, spinifex grass, and temperatures that can literally cook human flesh. It's the kind of place where Aboriginal people, with thousands of years of desert wisdom, travel only with extensive preparation and deep knowledge of water sources. Bogucki had neither. What he had was faith, determination, and a plan that seemed reasonable in the air-conditioned comfort of Perth. Walk northwest from the mining town of Newman toward the coast, following what he believed were established roads and paths. It was supposed to take maybe a week, maybe 10 days at most. On July 11, 1999, Robert Bogucki set out from Newman with a small backpack containing minimal supplies. He carried about 4 liters of water, roughly enough for 2 days in moderate conditions. He had some basic food, a hat, and clothes suitable for desert hiking. What he didn't have was a GPS, a satellite phone, an emergency beacon, or any means of calling for help if things went wrong. Most critically, he didn't have accurate maps of the area he was entering. The first day was almost pleasant. The morning was cool, the desert beautiful in its harsh majesty. Bogucki made good progress, feeling confident in his direction and his mission. As a fire protection engineer, he was used to working in hot conditions. As a devout Christian, he felt protected by his faith. But as the sun climbed higher and the temperature soared past 100 degrees, the desert began to reveal its true nature. By afternoon, the heat was crushing. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance, that turns every breath into an effort, that seems to suck moisture from your body through your skin. Bogucki's water consumption increased dramatically. What he had planned to last 2 days was disappearing much faster than expected. Still, he pressed on. This was supposed to be a test, a challenge. The discomfort was part of the experience. The second day brought higher temperatures and a devastating realization. He was lost. The roads and paths he thought he was following were either non-existent or led in directions that made no sense. The landscape all looked the same: endless red sand, scattered scrub, rocky outcrops that provided no shade and no guidance. Worse, his water was almost gone. By the end of day 2, July 12, 1999, Robert Bogucki faced a reality that would have sent most people into panic. He was completely lost in one of the world's most dangerous deserts, with no water, no way to call for help, and no idea which direction led to safety. The logical thing to do would have been to stay put, conserve energy, and hope someone would find him. But Bogucki had no way of knowing that anyone was even looking for him. His family back in Colorado expected him to be out of contact for weeks, so he made the decision that would either save his life or kill him. He kept walking. As night fell on July 12, 1999, Robert Bogucki was about to enter a hell that would test every limit of human endurance. He had no way of knowing that he was beginning a 12-day ordeal that medical science says should have been impossible to survive. All he knew was that stopping meant dying. So he held on to the only thing he had left, the belief that somehow, some way, he would find water and find his way home. The desert was about to teach him what human beings are really capable of when death is the only alternative to survival. Day 3, July 13th, 1999. No water for 24 hours. This is when Robert Bogucki's body began its desperate rebellion against the impossible situation he had placed it in. This is when the human machine, deprived of its most essential fuel, started the process of slowly consuming itself to stay alive. The first symptoms of severe dehydration hit like a freight train. His mouth became so dry that his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Saliva, that basic bodily function we never think about, simply stopped being produced. Swallowing became painful, then impossible. His lips cracked and split, bleeding in the scorching sun. But the mouth was just the beginning. His kidneys, those miraculous filters that clean our blood and regulate our fluid balance, began shutting down. Urine production slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The waste products that should have been flushed from his system began building up in his bloodstream like poison. His blood pressure dropped dangerously low as his cardiovascular system struggled to function with inadequate fluid volume. His heart had to work harder and harder to pump thickening blood through a system designed for a body that was properly hydrated. Most terrifyingly, his brain began to malfunction. Dehydration doesn't just affect your body, it attacks your mind. As fluid levels drop, the brain literally begins to shrink inside the skull. Cognitive function deteriorates rapidly. Decision-making becomes impaired. Hallucinations begin. Bogucki started seeing things that weren't there. Water where there was none. Roads leading to salvation that existed only in his oxygen-starved brain. People approaching in the distance who vanished when he got closer. But somehow, impossibly, he kept walking. Day 4 brought temperatures that soared past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of heat that makes metal too hot to touch, that can cause heat stroke in minutes, even for properly hydrated people. For a man who hadn't had water in 48 hours, it should have been a death sentence. Bogucki's body temperature regulation system began to fail. Sweating, the body's primary cooling mechanism, had stopped. There simply wasn't enough fluid left to spare. His core temperature began to rise toward levels that would cook his organs from the inside. His skin, normally elastic and resilient, became papery and fragile. When pinched, it would stay tented for long seconds, a clear sign of severe dehydration that emergency medical technicians recognize as life-threatening. His muscles began cramping violently as electrolyte imbalances wreaked havoc on his nervous system. Every step became agony. His legs felt like they weighed hundreds of pounds. His coordination deteriorated to the point where he stumbled constantly over terrain that should have been easy to navigate. But still, he walked. Day 5, Day 6. Each sunrise brought new torments, new ways for his body to remind him that human beings aren't designed to survive without water for this long. His eyes became so dry that blinking was painful. Tears, another bodily function we take for granted, had stopped completely. His vision became blurry, then started to tunnel as his brain struggled to function on the edge of catastrophic dehydration. His joints swelled and became inflexible as the synovial fluid that lubricates them became too thick to function properly. Every movement was stiff, painful, mechanical. He began to move like an old man, shuffling rather than walking, conserving every possible ounce of energy. But perhaps most devastating of all was the hunger. By day 6, with no food and no water, Bogucki's body had entered full starvation mode. His metabolism, desperately trying to conserve energy, had slowed to barely survival levels. His body began consuming its own muscle tissue for energy, literally eating itself alive. He could feel himself shrinking. His clothes, which had fit normally when he started his journey, began hanging loosely on his rapidly diminishing frame. His face became gaunt, his cheeks hollow. His body was transforming him into a living skeleton. Medical experts who would later study his case estimated that by day 6, he had lost over 25 pounds. 25 pounds of muscle, fat, and fluid that his body had consumed to keep his vital organs functioning for just a few more hours. Any rational person would have stopped walking, would have found whatever shade they could and waited to die. The pain was unbearable. The confusion was overwhelming. The physical deterioration was visible and terrifying. But Robert Bogucki was no longer operating on rational thought. Somewhere in his failing brain, in the part of the human mind that defies medical explanation, a voice kept saying the same thing over and over. Just one more step. He was about to discover that sometimes when your body gives up, your spirit can carry you further than should be humanly possible.
Day 7, July 19th, 1999. 1 week without water in hell. This is when Robert Bogucki's mind, pushed beyond every limit that human psychology can endure, began to fracture and rebuild itself in ways that would forever change his understanding of what it means to be human. The hallucinations that had started as occasional mirages now dominated his reality. His oxygen-starved brain, desperate to make sense of an impossible situation, began creating an alternate world where survival might be possible. He saw cities in the distance, Perth maybe, or some other salvation, with cool buildings and flowing water. He would walk toward them for hours, his damaged body somehow finding energy it shouldn't have had, only to watch them dissolve into heat shimmers as he approached. He saw people, travelers who had stopped to help him, rescue workers who had finally found him, family members who had come to bring him home. He would call out to them, his voice a painful croak from his desiccated throat, and they would vanish like smoke in the desert wind. Most cruelly, he saw water everywhere. Crystal clear streams flowing through the red sand, cool pools hidden behind rock formations, even rain clouds that seemed to promise relief from the relentless sun. His brain, desperate for the one thing that could save his life, created elaborate fantasies of hydration that made his real situation even more agonizing. But something else was happening in the desert. Something that Bogucki, a deeply religious man, interpreted as divine intervention. He began to experience what he would later describe as direct communication with God. Not voices exactly, but an unmistakable presence that seemed to guide his steps and provide comfort in his darkest moments. This presence told him to keep walking, assured him that he would survive, gave him strength when his body had none left to give. Skeptics might dismiss these experiences as the delusions of a dying brain. But something was keeping Robert Bogucki alive when medical science said he should have been dead days ago. Something was providing the will to continue when his body had long since given up. Day 8 brought a new horror. His body began eating his heart. When a human being reaches extreme starvation, the body doesn't just consume fat and muscle tissue. It begins breaking down organs to provide energy for the brain and other vital functions. Bogucki could feel his heart struggling, beating irregularly as the cardiac muscle itself was metabolized to keep him alive for a few more hours. His liver, that chemical processing plant that filters toxins from the blood, began failing. Without adequate fluid to flush waste products from his system, his body was slowly poisoning itself. His skin took on a yellow tinge as his liver struggled to function with no support. His kidneys had effectively shut down completely. The buildup of waste products in his bloodstream should have sent him into a coma days ago. That he was still conscious, still walking, still fighting, defied every medical textbook ever written. Day 9. Day 10. Each step was now a victory against biology itself. Bogucki's weight had dropped from 149 pounds to somewhere around 110, a loss of nearly 40 pounds in 10 days. His body fat percentage had dropped to essentially zero. His muscle mass had been reduced to the absolute minimum needed to keep his vital organs functioning. He looked like a concentration camp survivor. His face was a skull covered by paper-thin skin. His arms and legs were twigs, barely capable of supporting his weight. His clothes hung on his frame like they were draped on a skeleton. But his eyes burned with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the physical one. The Robert Bogucki who had entered the desert as a tourist was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused, refined down to pure survival instinct and unshakable faith. He no longer felt hunger. Pain had become just another sensation to be ignored. Thirst was so overwhelming that his brain had stopped processing it as a discrete feeling. It had become his entire reality. He spoke constantly to the presence he felt accompanying him. Not prayers exactly, but conversations with what he believed was divine guidance. These conversations provided the psychological anchor that kept him from complete mental collapse. Just keep walking, the presence seemed to say. One more step, one more day. Help is coming. On day 10, as the sun set on another impossible day of survival, Bogucki faced a truth that would have broken most people. He was going to die in this desert. His body had given everything it had. Medical science said he should have been dead already. But something inside him, call it faith, call it stubbornness, call it the indomitable human spirit, refused to accept death as inevitable. As the desert night brought its blessed coolness, Robert Bogucki prepared for what might be his final walk into the sunrise. He had no way of knowing that rescue was finally impossibly close. All he knew was that tomorrow, like every day before, he would take one more step, and then another, and another. Because sometimes when death seems certain, the only rational response is to keep doing the impossible.
While Robert Bogucki wandered through his desert hell, completely alone and convinced he would die unknown in the vast wasteland, the largest search and rescue operation in Western Australian history was mobilizing to find him. It had taken days for anyone to realize he was missing. Bogucki's family in Colorado expected him to be out of contact for weeks during his Australian adventure. His rental car, found abandoned at Newman, didn't immediately trigger alarm bells. Tourists often left vehicles there to explore on foot. It wasn't until July 16th, 5 full days after he'd entered the desert, that anyone understood a man was lost in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. When the realization hit, the response was massive and immediate. The Western Australia Police coordinated the effort, but this was too big for any single agency. Search and rescue volunteers poured in from across the region. The Royal Australian Air Force deployed helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. Aboriginal trackers, whose ancestors had survived in this desert for 40,000 years, joined the search with knowledge that no Western training could provide. The search area was nightmarish in its scope. The Great Sandy Desert, where Bogucki was lost, covers 140,000 square miles, larger than New Mexico. He could be anywhere within that vast expanse, and every hour that passed reduced his chances of survival exponentially. Sergeant Steve Hansen of the Western Australia Police coordinated the ground search. A veteran of dozens of desert rescues, he knew the statistics. People lost in the desert without water rarely survive more than 3 days. By day 5, when the search began, they were likely looking for a body, but they kept searching anyway. The aerial search was led by helicopter pilot Glenn Arnott, whose aircraft could cover vast distances quickly, but who knew that spotting a single person in the desert from the air was like finding a needle in a haystack. The desert's red sand camouflaged everything. From 500 feet up, a human being was essentially invisible unless they were in an open area and actively signaling.
The Aboriginal trackers brought skills that amazed even the professional search teams. Jimmy Nolan and Trevor Dan, both from the local Pilbara region, could read signs in the sand that were completely invisible to Western eyes. A disturbed pebble here, a bent blade of grass there. They could follow traces of human passage that others couldn't even see. But even their legendary skills were being tested by the vastness of the search area and the time that had already passed. Day 6 of the search, day 10 of Bogucki's ordeal. The operation was consuming enormous resources. Multiple helicopters burning thousands of dollars of fuel per hour. Dozens of volunteers taking time off work to comb through impossible terrain. The financial cost was approaching $100,000 per day. More importantly, the emotional toll on the searchers was becoming devastating. These were professionals who had dedicated their lives to saving people in distress. They understood that somewhere in the desert, a man was dying slowly and horribly while they flew overhead without seeing him. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. Helena Kennedy, a volunteer searcher, would later describe the feeling. "We knew he was out there somewhere, probably already dead, but maybe still clinging to life. Every square mile we searched without finding him felt like a personal failure. We weren't just looking for a missing person, we were racing against time to prevent a horrible death." The search patterns became increasingly desperate and creative. Grid searches that covered the same areas multiple times from different angles. Low-altitude flights that risked the aircraft but maximized the chances of spotting someone on the ground. Ground teams walking line abreast through terrain that could kill them if they became separated. But the desert seemed determined to keep its victim. False alarms came regularly. Shadows that looked like a person from the air. Disturbed sand that suggested human activity but led nowhere. Pieces of fabric that turned out to be natural debris. Each false alarm was devastating, a moment of hope followed by crushing disappointment. The psychological pressure on Chief Superintendent John Tuttle, who commanded the overall operation, was enormous. He was spending public money on a scale that demanded justification. The families of the searchers were worried about their safety. Media coverage was intensifying daily. But worst of all, he was starting to face the question that haunts every search commander. When do you stop looking? Official policy said that in these conditions, survival beyond 4 days was essentially impossible. They were now at day 10. The logical decision was to scale back the search, perhaps calling it off entirely except for occasional aerial sweeps. But something kept them going. Call it professional duty, call it human compassion, call it the refusal to abandon someone who might still be fighting for his life. Dr. Michael Henderson, the emergency physician advising the search team, was brutally honest about their chances. If this man is alive after 10 days without water in these conditions, it would represent one of the most extreme survival cases in medical history. The human body simply cannot function without hydration for this long. We should be looking for remains, not a living person. But the searchers refused to give up hope entirely. On day 11 of the search, day 15 of Bogucki's impossible journey, they decided to make one final massive effort. Every available aircraft, every volunteer, every resource they could marshal would be deployed for what they privately acknowledged might be their last attempt. They had no way of knowing that the man they were looking for was still walking, still fighting, still holding on to life by sheer force of will. They had no way of knowing that their final search was about to become one of the most miraculous rescues in Australian history. All they knew was that somewhere in that vast desert,
a fellow human being was either dead or dying, and they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't try one more time to bring him home.
Day 9, July 21st, 1999. Robert Bogucki was no longer human in any recognizable sense. What walked through the desert on that scorching morning was something else entirely. A collection of bones and sinew animated by pure will. A skeleton covered in paper-thin skin that continued moving long after the body that housed it should have collapsed and died. His weight had dropped to approximately 105 pounds, a loss of 44 pounds in 9 days. To put that in perspective, cancer patients in the final stages of terminal illness typically lose weight more slowly. Bogucki's body had consumed itself at a rate that medical science considered impossible for a living person. His muscle mass had been reduced to the absolute minimum required to keep his heart beating and his lungs functioning. His arms were twigs, his legs were barely capable of supporting even his drastically reduced weight. Every step required enormous effort, every movement a conscious decision to continue living. His face had become a skull, his cheeks were hollow caverns, his eyes had sunk so deep into his head that they appeared to be looking out from dark wells. His lips had disappeared entirely, leaving only cracked, bleeding tissue stretched over his teeth. But somehow, impossibly, he kept walking. The hallucinations had evolved into something more complex and persistent. Bogucki was now living in multiple realities simultaneously. Part of him understood that he was dying alone in the desert, but another part of his consciousness existed in a world where help was always just over the next ridge, where water was available, where survival was possible. His conversations with what he believed was divine presence had become constant. Not just comfort in times of crisis, but ongoing dialogue that provided the psychological framework for his impossible survival. "I can't do this anymore," he would whisper through cracked lips that could barely form words. "Yes, you can. One more step. Help is coming." Day 10 brought a new level of physical horror. His circulatory system, struggling to function with inadequate fluid volume, began shutting down in his extremities. His hands and feet became numb, then painful, then numb again as circulation dwindled to nothing. His fingers and toes began to turn blue, then black as tissue died from lack of blood flow. His kidneys had failed completely days earlier. The waste products that should have been filtered from his blood were now poisoning his entire system. His skin had taken on a yellow-green tinge as toxins built up to levels that should have caused death by uremic poisoning. His heart, struggling to pump blood that had become thick as syrup, developed an irregular rhythm that could stop at any moment. Each beat was a victory against cardiovascular collapse. Each minute that his heart continued to function was borrowed time. But perhaps most devastating of all was what was happening to his brain. Severe dehydration causes the brain to literally shrink inside the skull. As fluid is lost, the gray matter pulls away from the bone, creating space that shouldn't exist. This process causes not just cognitive impairment, but physical pain as neural tissue is stretched and damaged. Bogucki's thinking had become fragmented and confused. He would lose track of where he was, what he was doing, sometimes even who he was. He would walk for hours with no memory of the journey. He would stop suddenly, unsure why he had been moving at all. Yet something deeper than conscious thought kept him moving forward. Day 11 was supposed to be impossible. Medical textbooks state categorically that humans cannot survive more than 5 to 7 days without water under extreme heat conditions. Bogucki had now survived more than double that time limit while continuously walking through some of the harshest terrain on Earth. He should have been dead. According to every piece of medical knowledge available to science, his body should have shut down days ago. The fact that he was still conscious, still mobile, still fighting, defied biological explanation. His circulatory system had failed completely. Its temperature regulation had failed completely. His core temperature fluctuated wildly, dangerously high during the day as his body's cooling systems had given up, then dropping to hypothermic levels at night as his metabolism couldn't generate enough heat. His digestive system had shut down entirely. Even if he had found food, his body could no longer process it. His stomach had atrophied, his intestines had stopped functioning. His body was running entirely on stored energy that should have been exhausted a week ago. His immune system had collapsed. Minor cuts and scrapes that would normally heal in days had become infected wounds. His body had no resources left to fight even the most basic bacterial infections. Yet, he walked. Each step was now a conscious decision to continue living. Each breath was a choice to fight for one more moment. Each sunrise was a victory over death itself. The presence he felt guiding him had become more real than the physical world around him. In his conversations with this divine companion, Bogucki found the strength to continue when his body had nothing left to give. "I don't think I can make it," he whispered as the sun set on day 11. "You don't have to make it. You just have to take the next step and then the next one. Help is coming tomorrow." As night fell on July 23, 1999, Robert Bogucki prepared for what might be his final night on Earth. His body had given everything it had and more. Medical science said he should already be dead. But somewhere in the desert darkness, as he lay down on the sand that might become his grave, he held on to the only thing he had left, faith that somehow, some way, morning would bring salvation. He had no way of knowing that rescue helicopters were already in the air, beginning what would be the final day of his impossible journey through hell. All he knew was that he had held on for 11 days when he should have died in 3. Tomorrow would either bring a miracle or it would bring the end of the most extraordinary survival story in modern history.
July 24, 1999, day 12, 5:47 a.m. Helicopter pilot Brad Peebles was 3 hours into what everyone expected to be another futile search when he spotted something that made his heart stop. A figure moving slowly across the red sand, leaving a wavering trail like a wounded animal. "I've got something," Peebles radioed back to base, his voice tight with disbelief. "There's someone walking down there." The response from Sergeant Steve Hansen was immediate. "Are you sure it's not debris or wildlife?" Peebles brought his helicopter lower, close enough to see details that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What he was looking at wasn't quite human anymore. It was a skeleton, covered in burnt leather, moving with the mechanical persistence of something that should have died days ago. "It's him," Peebles whispered into his radio. "My God, it's actually him, and he's still walking." The rescue that followed was unlike anything in the annals of Australian search and rescue. As the helicopter descended, Robert Bogucki looked up with eyes that had sunk so deep into his skull they were barely visible. His face was a death mask of cracked skin and exposed bone. His clothes hung on his frame like burial shrouds. But he was conscious. Incredibly, impossibly, he was aware and responsive. Peebles landed his helicopter 50 meters away, afraid that the rotor wash might knock down the skeletal figure that was somehow still standing. Paramedic Sarah Collins jumped out and ran toward Bogucki, expecting to find a man in the final moments of life. What she found instead was something that defied her medical training. "Sir, can you hear me?" Collins called out as she approached. Bogucki turned toward her voice with movements that seemed to take enormous effort. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, forced through a throat that hadn't produced saliva in over a week. "I knew you'd come," he said. "He told me you'd come today." Collins later described the moment. "I've been a paramedic for 15 years. I've seen people in the final stages of dehydration before. This man should have been unconscious or dead. Instead, he was standing, talking, and somehow still fighting. It was the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed." The immediate medical assessment was terrifying. Bogucki's blood pressure was so low it was barely detectable. His pulse was weak and irregular, a heart that should have stopped beating days ago. His core body temperature fluctuated wildly as his body's regulatory systems had completely failed. His weight had dropped from 149 pounds to 105 pounds, a loss of 44 pounds in 12 days. His body fat percentage was essentially zero. His muscle mass had been reduced to the absolute minimum required to keep vital organs functioning. Most shocking of all, his blood work would later reveal kidney function so compromised that he should have been in a coma from uremic poisoning. The waste products in his bloodstream were at levels typically seen only in corpses. Yet he was conscious, coherent, and somehow still capable of walking. The helicopter flight to Royal Perth Hospital was a race against time. Dr. Michael Henderson, the emergency physician who had coordinated medical support for the search, was waiting with a trauma team prepared for the worst. "When they brought him in, my first thought was that we were too late," he would later recall. "He looked like a concentration camp survivor. I've never seen a living person so close to death who was still conscious and responsive." The medical team immediately began aggressive fluid resuscitation, but they had to be careful. When someone has been severely dehydrated for this long, too much fluid too quickly can cause fatal complications as the body's systems try to readjust. Bogucki's kidneys, which had shut down completely, began producing small amounts of urine as IV fluids slowly restored his blood volume. His heart rhythm stabilized as his cardiovascular system received the support it desperately needed. But perhaps most remarkably, his mental state remained clear throughout the initial treatment. "Where am I?" he asked Dr. Henderson. "You're in Perth Hospital. You've been lost in the desert for 12 days." Bogucki's response stunned everyone in the emergency room. "I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was, and I knew you'd find me when it was time." Over the following hours and days, as Bogucki slowly returned from the edge of death, the full magnitude of his survival became clear to the medical team treating him. He had survived 12 days without water in conditions that should have killed him in 3. He had lost more weight in less time than medical science thought possible for a living person. He had continued walking and remained conscious with kidney failure, heart irregularities, and blood chemistry that should have been fatal. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the nephrologist who treated his kidney failure, was blunt in her assessment. "This case will be studied in medical schools for decades. By every measure we have, this man should not have survived. The fact that he's alive, talking, and apparently suffering no permanent organ damage is, well, it's miraculous." The story that emerged over the following days captivated not just Australia, but the world. News crews arrived at the hospital to interview the man who had survived the impossible. Scientists wanted to study his case to understand the absolute limits of human endurance. Religious leaders hailed his survival as proof of divine intervention. But for Robert Bogucki, lying in his hospital bed as his body slowly remembered how to function normally, the experience had been about something simpler and more profound. "I was never alone out there," he told reporters. "Even when my body was failing, even when I couldn't think clearly, I had help, I had guidance, I had the strength to take one more step and then another, because I wasn't doing it by myself." The 12 days that should have killed him
had instead become a testament to the power of faith, determination, and the human spirit's refusal to surrender, even when death seems certain. Robert Bogucki had walked through the valley of death for 12 days and emerged on the other side. He had proven that sometimes, when medical science says survival is impossible, the only rational response is to keep holding on anyway.
3 weeks after his rescue, Robert Bogucki walked out of Royal Perth Hospital on his own 2 feet. The man who had been given last rites by his own body in the desert was not only alive, but recovering completely from an ordeal that medical science said should have been impossible to survive. The numbers still stagger doctors who study extreme survival cases. 12 days without water in 120-degree heat, a weight loss of 44 pounds in less than 2 weeks, complete kidney failure, cardiovascular collapse, and blood chemistry that should have caused death by organ failure. Yet somehow, he had not only survived, he had continued walking, remained conscious, and suffered no permanent damage. Dr. Michael Henderson, who led his emergency treatment, puts it simply, "In 30 years of emergency medicine, I've never seen anything like it." Robert Bogucki survived beyond the absolute limits of human physiology. If I hadn't treated him myself, I wouldn't believe it was possible. But the Robert Bogucki who returned to Colorado was fundamentally changed by his 12 days in hell. The experience had stripped away everything non-essential, not just the 44 pounds his body had consumed to stay alive, but psychological and spiritual layers that he had carried his entire life. He had been reduced to the absolute core of human existence, the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. "People ask me how I survived," Bogucki reflects years later. "They want to know what techniques I used, what training I had, what special knowledge kept me alive. The truth is, I didn't survive on my own. When my body failed, when my mind couldn't function, when logic said I should lie down and die, something else carried me forward." That something else has sparked debate among scientists, theologians, and survival experts for over 2 decades. Skeptics point to documented cases of extreme dehydration survival and suggest that Bogucki's religious interpretation of his experience reflects the hallucinations and altered mental states that accompany severe physiological stress. They argue that human beings are occasionally capable of surviving beyond normal limits, and that his case, while extreme, fits within the possible range of human endurance. Believers see his survival as clear evidence of divine intervention, a modern miracle that demonstrates the power of faith to sustain life when all earthly resources are exhausted. But perhaps the most important aspect of Bogucki's story isn't whether you believe in miracles or extraordinary human resilience. The most important aspect is what his 12 days in the desert teach us about the power of refusing to give up. In our modern world, we face challenges that can seem insurmountable. Economic hardship that stretches on indefinitely. Health crises that test our physical and emotional reserves. Personal losses that threaten to break our spirit. Professional setbacks that challenge everything we've worked for. When we face these modern deserts, these periods when our resources are exhausted, our support systems have failed, and we can't see any path forward, Robert Bogucki's story provides a template for endurance that transcends the specific circumstances of his survival. He didn't survive because he was physically stronger than other people. He wasn't a trained survivalist or an experienced desert traveler. He had no special equipment or emergency supplies. What he had was something much simpler and much more powerful: the absolute refusal to accept death as inevitable. Day after day, step after step, when his body was failing and his mind was fracturing, he chose to continue, not because he had a plan, not because he could see rescue coming, but because the only alternative was surrender. The lesson isn't about desert survival techniques or extreme physical conditioning. The lesson is about what happens when you hold on for just one more day, take just one more step, fight for just one more breath, especially when logic says it's pointless. Medical researchers who have studied Bogucki's case suggest that his survival may have been aided by a psychological phenomenon known as stress inoculation. The idea that people who maintain hope and purpose under extreme stress can sometimes access physical reserves that would otherwise remain unavailable. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who specializes in extreme survival cases, explains, "When people face impossible situations with unwavering determination, the mind-body connection can sometimes produce results that seem to defy medical explanation. It's as if the refusal to give up triggers biological responses we don't fully understand. Whether you call it faith, call it determination, call it the indomitable human spirit, or call it medical anomaly, the result is the same. Sometimes when everything rational says you should quit, holding on for one more moment can lead to miraculous outcomes." Robert Bogucki's 12 days in the Australian desert remind us that human beings are capable of surviving things that seem impossible, that hope can be a literal lifeline when all other resources are exhausted, that the decision to keep fighting even when fighting seems pointless can sometimes make the difference between life and death. In our Hold On Survival Stories series, we've seen this pattern repeatedly. Ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and chose to endure rather than surrender. People who discovered reserves of strength they never knew they had when the alternative was giving up entirely. Bogucki's story is unique in its extremity, but universal in its message. When you're walking through your own desert, whether it's measured in days, months, or years, when your resources are exhausted and rescue seems impossible, when logic says you should stop fighting, remember the man who walked for 12 days without water and lived to tell about it. Remember that sometimes the only thing separating survival from surrender is the simple, stubborn decision to take one more step. This has been Hold On Survival Stories. Thank you for joining us on Robert Bogucki's incredible journey through 12 days of hell and back to life. If his story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others who need to be reminded that no matter how impossible your situation seems, no matter how long you've been fighting, no matter how distant rescue appears, your miracle might be just one more step away. Until next time, remember, when you're lost in the desert of your own challenges, when death seems more logical than hope, when every voice of reason tells you to give up, hold on. Your rescue might be closer than you think.